to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. On May 14th, 1948, the Jewish community living in Israel signed a Declaration of Independence. That moment marked the birth of a nation, the first Jewish state in their ancient homeland in 2,000 years. So today in this video, we're discussing what is the Israeli Declaration of Independence and how did it shape the state today. So Josiah, starting off our conversation today, why do we need to study the Declaration of Independence of Israel?
Yeah, fair question. I think a Declaration of Independence is really a sacred text for any country, especially a young country. Israel is still a relatively young country.
Yes.
And it usually includes some important notes about who that country is, what it hopes to become, that are important if you want to understand what is Israel, or if you want to understand how the world relates to Israel, or how we perhaps should relate to Israel. Then you have to understand, how do they define themselves, essentially. And that's basically what a Declaration of Independence is sort of this definition of terms of what does it mean to be Israel. It establishes a national identity. It asserts certain rights like self-determination. Basically, why should we exist? Why should we be allowed to exist? And it justifies their independence, their sovereignty, especially on a specific piece of territory. And it explains the values which define this state of Israel, or in theory define the state of Israel. And it extends hands to others as well for help and or peace. And so it really does contextualize in many ways what it means to not just be Israel, but also for the rest of the world to think about how it relates to Israel.
Absolutely. So signing the Declaration of Independence for the Jewish community in Israel in 1948 was a really big deal.
Yeah.
So what led the Jewish community to make the decision to sign this Declaration of Independence?
So by 1948, the conflict between the political Zionist movement and the local Arab community, or even the Arab countries surrounding it, had been around for a while. And you can learn more about that. We have videos in the Israel Explained series, both on political Zionism and how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began. There's some historical context in those videos, I think, that is helpful, and our viewers might enjoy those. But suffice it to say, 1948 was not the beginning of the conflict. So we just get that out there. For the purposes of today's conversation, however, there's a couple of things I think that are important to highlight. So beginning in the 1800s, the Jews had been returning in large numbers to the land of Israel, or Palestine, as the Romans had named it, and it had been known basically since, and especially under the Ottoman Empire, it was referred to as Palestine when the Jews were returning to it. In 1922, Great Britain took control of the territory after World War I. And prior to that, it had been under, again, this control of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire, but from 1922 until 1948, it was going to be under British control. They were going to be the ones there trying to manage both Arab and Jewish desires to create a state. So they had a lot of conflicting agendas that they were trying to manage as sort of the power in charge. There was a lot of conflict. They tried to manage it in a few different ways by, for example, limiting Jewish immigration, which was obviously not very popular with the Jewish people, particularly during and after the Holocaust and the atrocities that they experienced in Europe that they were trying to escape. They also tried to divide the territory, which was a little more popular with the Jewish community than it was the Arab community, which was strongly opposed to every attempt to divide the territory or partition it. But in 1937, the British Peel Commission did try. They recommended a partition plan that was rejected. Following World War II, there was a lot of pressure again on the British to settle this question. They were feeling this pressure internationally. They were feeling this pressure from the local Jewish and Arab communities in the land. They were also just feeling economic pressure. They just fought a major war. Their empire was sort of crumbling around the edges. And it was just very expensive to maintain, especially given the financial burden that had been surviving World War II and the German onslaught. So they needed a way out, essentially. In 1947, the United Nations put together another partition plan. The Arab leaders again rejected this, even though the Jewish community accepted it. And at this point, it was clear that there was going to be no peaceful resolution to the conflict, essentially. It was just going to extend indefinitely. It was kind of this stalemate.
Yeah.
And Great Britain said, we're out, we're leaving. So they decided to leave in May 1948. And preparations began in advance, months in advance. It was kind of clear that this was going to be the point at which Great Britain was going to leave. There was going to be a conflict on that date. The fighting had already been ongoing for months at that point. And the Jewish community realized that they were going to be at war almost immediately with the local Arab community, as well as probably the surrounding Arab countries, which they were in 1948. And so they had to do something. They had to basically decide, are we going to be declaring independence? Are we going to declare that we are a state that has the right to be here and stay? And how are we going to make our case to the world that we have a right to be here?
Yeah.
And at the same time, explain to the world who we are and who we want to be and what we want to achieve and accomplish as a Jewish state in the land of Israel.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting talking about the purpose that this declaration served in Israel. It served obviously a very important purpose for the community at the time, just declaring like, hey, this is what is going to happen. These are our rights. But also it served a broader message to the whole international community of, hey, this is who we are. So I want to talk a little bit about what Jewish rights were spoken about in this Declaration of Independence. So can you kind of just give us a walkthrough of what was discussed?
Love to. And I'm going to do that by just reading several portions of the Declaration. Throughout this video, I'm going to try to read as much as possible of the Declaration so that you can hear it for yourself, and then we'll sort of explain what's being said and why a little bit. So there's a portion talking about Jewish rights, and this is near the beginning, actually, of the Declaration, where it says, in quotes, Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, and this is referring to biblical times, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. Again, referring to the Bible. So the Declaration immediately starts by making two key arguments about how the Jews perceive themselves. They are a people and a nation, not just a religion. And that was one of the keys to the conflict until that point, and even today, that people would argue, the Jewish people are a religious group. They're not an ethno-national group that has a connection to any specific piece of land, historically speaking. And immediately, again, one of the first things in the Declaration of Independence is a refutation of that argument, saying, no, our history is in the land of Israel. And because of that history, we know that we're not just a religious group, but also an ethno-national group, a people group. And we have a connection to this place that helps us form the basis of our shared identity. Later on in the Declaration, you also read a quote, or hear a quote that says, after being forcibly exiled from their land, the people remained faithful to it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. End quote. So they didn't leave voluntarily, is what this statement is saying. It's true that the Jewish people for many years did not have a sizable presence. They always had a small presence, but not a large presence. And they certainly did not have a government in the land of Israel for many centuries. But what this is arguing is that the people that were forced into exile, one, that it implies that being in exile means that you're not home, meaning that their home was in the land of Israel. But also what they're saying is that they did not leave voluntarily. They were forced to leave. And the land is what they consider to be home. It represents not just their identity, but also the space in which they can fully realize their political freedom and their self-determination. It also, the Declaration makes the claim again here very, very specifically, not just that we were once here, but they have a right to be there again. And not just to be there, but to once again govern themselves in this homeland. There's another quote. I'm just going to keep reading because there's a lot of good stuff in here. Quote, "The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people," so now, the Declaration's kind of fast forwarding a little bit, past biblical history, past exile, the period of exile or diaspora, and now is referring to the Holocaust. So this catastrophe, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel, again, the land of Israel, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the community of nations. So it's outlining this argument, essentially, that the Jews couldn't determine their fate anywhere else. This really was the only place that they could be safe and govern themselves because it was their homeland, and anywhere else they had tried to make a home, they had been rejected, and in the most recent history, massacred, actually. It reads on, quote, "This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state." So they're reclaiming a sense of agency that they had lost and making the argument that to deny them a state would in fact be a form of discrimination.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting to consider any country's Declaration of Independence because that's such a significant part of any nation's history. But I just think that what you were reading to us just earlier is just so powerful and so beautiful because it's showing the significance of the history of the land. And this was written right after the Holocaust and just how much that impacted the state of Israel today, but especially then. So I wanted to ask you now, when we're talking about a Declaration of Independence, what kind of legal justifications does this provide a new state?
Well, I'm not sure it provides so much as it outlines them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not sure you have to have a Declaration of Independence to be a state, but what the Declaration does is it outlines them essentially, and it describes them for the rest of the world so that people can evaluate if the state does in fact have a right to exist. So it starts with this. We've just sort of outlined a little bit this idea that there's some ancient connection to the land of Israel, that there are basic rights that most people have to govern themselves in their homeland and to protect themselves. It also appealed to some various forms of international law and previous declarations. Some of these basic forms of international law were a little bit new at the time, actually. So a few examples for you. There's the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government basically said that they intended to create not necessarily a Jewish state, but a Jewish homeland again in their ancient homeland of the land of Israel. And they argued that that should be interpreted as such that they could create a state for themselves if necessary to govern themselves and protect themselves. They also argued that there's the British Mandate given by the League of Nations in 1922, which gave the British authority to decide who's going to have a state and not. And because the British had, again, repeatedly recommended that the Jewish people have a state in the Peel Commission, for example, 1937, they argued that this created some legal precedent why they should be allowed, again, to have a state. And then there's the United Nations resolution in 1947, which was a broad recommendation by the international community that the land should be partitioned and that the Jewish people should have a state of their own in addition to the local Arab community. So we'll read some more here for some more on this. This is another quote from the Declaration, which says, "On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, land of Israel. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable." So their argument essentially is that they were not acting unilaterally. They were actually complying with instructions given by the United Nations. because the UN didn't just say, we think that the territory should be partitioned. They said that the inhabitants should follow through and take the steps necessary in order to actually create these two states. And so the argument the Jewish community is making is we're following instructions given to us by the international community to actually create a state of our own. And it committed to continue cooperating with the UN on the implementation of the resolution. It also outlines some steps that it had taken to form a government. And this isn't some legalese, but worth noting here that they had thought this through, and you have to think this through if you're going to create a state. How are you going to govern yourself? So it says, for example, quote, we declare that with effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, the eve of Sabbath, what it's referring to is the British mandate ending.
Yeah.
When the British were leaving. It has the date here, the 6th ER, 5708, 15th May 1948, until the establishment of the elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which shall be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly not later than the 1st October 1948. The People's Council shall act as a provisional council of state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, shall be the provisional government of the Jewish state to be called Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, again, most of that is basically legalese, which probably sounds a little bit boring, but it's important because what it's doing is it's basically sending a message back to the UN and the international community. You told us to take steps to create a state. Here are the steps we've taken. We are in compliance with your instructions. Please help us to follow through on the instructions that you gave us, basically. Yeah. And what is worth noting here is that this is one of the first places in writing that the new state's name would be used, that it would be called Israel would be the name of the new state. Very significant note there.
Wow, that's very interesting. So we've talked a lot about the legal justifications for Israel declaring themselves as an independent state. So what kind of values are laid out for Israel in the Declaration of Independence? So in writing this document, what kind of values are they committing themselves to?
So there's quite a few. And I think, if you think back to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, for example, we're pretty familiar with language used in there. We believe that all men are created equal, that sort of thing, endowed with certain inalienable rights by their creator. These are words and phrases that are pretty ingrained into the American collective psyche or consciousness. We know that these are sort of the founding values of America that are enshrined in our own Declaration of Independence. Israel has some similar things that are sort of baked into it as well. Obviously, we're much less familiar with them because it's not our own Declaration of Independence, but there's a few quotes I'll share with you that are sort of similar language or designed to emphasize similar values. Mm-hmm. So, for example, this quote says, Israel will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. So it's very optimistic. It's very progress-oriented. Mm-hmm. It's very inclusive. Again, similar to this idea that all people are created equal. The idea that the country should serve the benefit of all its inhabitants. Mm-hmm. There's another quote that says, Israel, will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, which is very interesting. References biblical language for what it means to be a place of justice and peace. Mm-hmm. For more on what that looks like, I think our viewers might really enjoy our Discovery Roots podcast.
Definitely.
There's some episodes on there about prophecy and justice and what does biblical justice mean? Yeah. What do the prophets view as a form of justice or a just peace in the world? There's other quotes. They also say things like, Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Mm-hmm. So it's obviously putting forth values that are very pluralistic, democratic. Israel will gain or guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. Yeah. So again, very pluralistic, very democratic. And finally, Israel will safeguard the holy places of all religions. So it's trying to demonstrate or send a message that Israel should be considered trustworthy in a place that upholds religious freedom for all of the inhabitants of the land. So it's a lot of language like this that's designed to sort of demonstrate what sort of principles or values about pluralism, democracy, religious freedom, living together, cohabiting the land, what that means to the new state of Israel.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to see these different values and qualities that we just talked about, how they play out in Israeli society. So on my first trip to Israel, I saw so many of these different values that we've talked about just at play in the things I was observing and in Israeli society.
Yeah.
But I didn't really realize at that point that these were things that were laid out in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. I remember one story that I just thought it was very powerful. Our Israeli guide, the first time I ever went to Israel with Passages, was talking about some different just challenges and political tensions and things like that had happened in the past year in Israel. And he said, he kind of ended his talk sharing these things with us, saying like, well, in this part of the world, in Israel, we have to be optimistic.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was really cool to hear him talk about that and to see that so prevalent in Israeli society, but also seeing it's in writing too. Like that's something that the founders of the modern state of Israel wanted to make sure was really important. And they knew that these would be things that this kind of country would need. So I just think that is really interesting, seeing the values that are influencing the modern state of Israel. So I want to talk a little bit now about how this Declaration of Independence was seeking to shape Israel's relationship with the rest of the world. So how did this document influence the way that other countries related to Israel?
So it really was trying to make clear a couple of things as early as possible. One, that the priority of the new state was the well-being of the Jewish people. And again, it had sort of made its case up until this point by saying that we are a people group, not just a religion. We have a specific homeland. We've also been victims recently of the Holocaust. And what they're doing is basically it's trying to say, we have to have the ability to protect ourselves because of what we've experienced and because we're a people group. We owe it to ourselves and to each other to live on as a people group and to protect our shared identity. So that was going to be a very early priority laid out. Even in everything we've already read, all the quotes we've read, I think you sort of pick up on that underlying theme. But there's going to be more on that we'll read in just a moment. The second thing is also offering this idea that they did want to collaborate. They were focused on Jewish well-being and protecting it, but they didn't want to be so insular that they didn't collaborate with the rest of the world towards this shared vision for human flourishing, if you will. So we'll just break those down by reading a couple of quotes so you can kind of see some different examples of both of those. On the issue of the well-being of the Jewish people, there's a couple of quotes that say things like, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. So they're laying out immediately in the Declaration of Independence, not even waiting until after the Declaration of Independence to reverse some of the British policy on restricting Jewish immigration. They're just from the get-go saying, no, we owe it to the Jewish people to provide them a safe haven, and then they will be allowed to return to the new state. And there's also a quote that says, we appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora, or the people that have been sort of scattered during the exile, to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel.
Wow. So
they're, again, calling out this dream to return to Israel. They're calling back to the fact that they used to all be here. This used to be their home. And the only reason that they are not is because they've been scattered into exile. But they're asking even those who are still scattered in exile to help them accomplish the dream of being able to be home again and together again. They're also, when it turns to again, the rest of the international community, because they're trying not to be super insular, there's a few things that they offer to the international community or ask of the international community as well. So a few quotes here. One, we appeal to the United Nations to assist the Jewish people in the building up of its state and to receive the state of Israel into the comity of nations. So again, you told us we could have a state.
Mhm.
You instructed us to take steps necessary in order to accomplish that objective. We've taken those necessary steps, and now we ask you to receive us as a state into the community of states that make up the United Nations and the international community at the time. The Declaration also says, we appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. So Israel knows that the local Arab community and the surrounding Arab countries are not going to be a fan of this declaration, and that there's going to be a war over what this declaration has to say, that the Jewish state has a right to exist. But even before that war is over, it's already extending a hand to local Arabs saying, you can be a part of this state too and be equal citizens and have due representation if you're willing to cooperate and make peace with us, essentially, and be a part of this project. Very meaningful that statement's made before the war is over.
Definitely.
The last quote that I'll read for you, which I think is also really good. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East.
Yeah.
So again, the war hasn't even started yet, although it's going to start the very next day.
Yeah.
And Israel is already asking for peace with its neighbors. It's making a point that it doesn't want war with its neighbors.
Exactly.
It's not choosing to make war against its neighbors. If only it was allowed to exist in peace, everything could be peaceful.
Yeah.
It knows that they're not likely to accept that, but it is offering them a way out of a war before it even starts by saying, we would like to make peace with you and be good neighbors and work together for the common good of the Middle East.
Absolutely. I think it's just really interesting to think about not only the values that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence, but also the expectations of how Israel would interact with their neighbors. Just right off the bat, they were saying, we want peace, we want to be good neighbors, and we want you to be good neighbors to us. So I want to talk now, as we're kind of wrapping up this episode, what sort of impact did the Declaration of Independence have on Israel at the time?
So in the short term, it didn't necessarily immediately boost Israel's reputation internationally. It didn't help Israel to gain recognition from many countries quickly. It was a relatively slow process of that happening. The United States was one exception that very quickly was the first actually to recognize the new state of Israel. But again, it was a slow process. And it was partially because the declaration had to be signed in secret, quote unquote. It's a funny story, actually. I mean, the news got out, so there was a large crowd standing outside, and it wasn't very secret about what was happening. But in theory, it had to be done in secret or a very short notice without a lot of public announcement or fanfare because a war was about to break out, and they had to be focused on the war, of course, but they also had to be concerned about safety for everyone who was signing the Declaration of Independence. Some people didn't actually get to sign it on the day of. They had to wait until later when they were able to make it and sign it because it was just a very dangerous time.
Yeah.
So it didn't stop the war. It didn't immediately achieve recognition, probably because the war was happening. It was hard to sort of generate a lot of public interest or fanfare. And some people, frankly, probably wanted to wait and see if Israel could survive the war before deciding whether to recognize it. But Israel did survive. It survived. It built a modern state. Later on, people did begin to recognize it. And like every country in the world, I think it's fair to say that Israel has not always lived up to the very high standards that are laid out in its declaration. It sets a very high bar.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the quotes we read for complete equality, pluralism, peace, harmony. I mean, it's almost like a declaration of utopia.
Yeah.
It's a very high standard
definitely.
to reach. And it hasn't always done that. I think the U.S. can probably say the same thing about our own Declaration of Independence. We've not always lived up to the ideals within it. but it did set the bar high.
Mhm.
And it's worth noting what kind of bar Israel set for itself, because that makes it a text that is worthy of studying to understand what are Israel's aspirations now and into the future.
Yeah. Well, Josiah, thank you so much for walking us through the Declaration of Independence. I know for me, it's definitely helped me understand the modern state of Israel a little bit more. And to our audience, thank you so much for watching this video today. If you have any questions about anything we discussed, please leave a comment below and we're happy to answer that for you. Also, be sure to check out the description below for more resources that might be helpful to you. If you're looking for more content related to the Middle East, be sure to check us out on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.